In the vast shimmering expanse of the Pacific Ocean, about 100 miles off the coast of San Diego, the world seems endless and untouchable. It was November, in the year 2004. The sun hung high, casting a brilliant gold across the water, a scene of absolute serenity. But beneath this calm surface and within the clear blue sky, the most advanced military technology on the planet was operating at its peak. This was the home of the USS Nimitz carrier strike group, a floating fortress representing the pinnacle of American naval power. Thousands of sailors and aviators went about their daily routines, convinced that they owned the skies. Among them was Commander David Fravor. Fravor was not a man given to flights of fancy or ghost stories. As a disciplined, no-nonsense Top Gun pilot and the commanding officer of Strike Fighter Squadron 41, his world was defined by physics, protocol, and the raw power of the Super Hornet jet he flew. To him, the sky was a workspace, a domain to be protected and mastered. He believed that if something was flying in his airspace, he would know what it was, and if it was a threat, he would know how to neutralize it. His entire career had been built on the absolute certainty of aerial superiority and the strength of the United States Navy. For several days, however, a shadow had been cast over this confidence, though not many knew it yet. Aboard the USS Princeton, a cruiser equipped with the sophisticated SPY-1 radar system, the operators had been witnessing something that defied every law of aviation they had ever studied. For a full week, the radar had been tracking what they called anomalous aerial vehicles. These were not mere glitches in the system. These objects would appear at an altitude of 80,000 feet, far above where most commercial or military aircraft even dare to go, and then, in a matter of seconds, they would drop straight down to just above the surface of the ocean. They would hover there for a while, stationary against the wind, before shooting back up or simply vanishing from the screen. The radar operators had recalibrated their equipment multiple times, thinking it must be a technical error, but the ghosts on the screen remained. They were real, they were fast, and they were completely impossible. The officers on the Princeton watched in stunned silence as the blips performed maneuvers that would crush any human pilot under the sheer force of gravity. On this particular afternoon, David Fravor and his wingman, Alex Dietrich, were out for what should have been a routine training mission. The sky was a perfect, cloudless blue, the kind of day pilots live for. They were practicing air combat maneuvers, the high-stakes dance of aerial dogfighting that requires total concentration. Suddenly, the voice of the air controller from the Princeton crackled into Fravor's headset. The tone was different this time. It wasn't the usual calm, professional chatter of a training exercise. It was heavy with a sense of urgency that caught Fravor's immediate attention. The controller informed him that they were being diverted. This was not a drill. The words used were a real-world vector. Fravor was told to head toward a specific set of coordinates to intercept an unidentified contact that had been appearing on their radar for days. The routine training mission had vanished in an instant, replaced by the electric tension of a live intercept. As Fravor and Dietrich turned their jets and pushed their throttles forward, the atmosphere inside the cockpit changed. The sunlight still flooded the canopy, but there was a growing sense of unease as they raced toward the unknown. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Fravor looked out over the horizon, scanning the empty blue for any sign of a traditional aircraft. No smoke trails, no glint of metal, nothing. As they approached the coordinates provided by the Princeton, the radar on their own jets remained strangely silent. They were flying toward a ghost that refused to be seen by their sensors. The air controller kept providing updates, guiding them closer and closer to a point in the ocean that seemed, from a distance, like any other patch of water. Fravor reached the location and began to circle high above. He looked down through the clear air at the ocean below. The Pacific was unusually calm that day, like a sheet of dark blue glass, making any disturbance easy to spot. But as Fravor looked closer, he noticed a strange patch of white water. It looked like waves breaking over a large submerged object, roughly the size of a Boeing 737. It was as if something massive was churning just beneath the waves, or perhaps something had just emerged from the depths. The water was frothing and bubbling in a circular pattern, standing out starkly against the deep blue of the surrounding sea. Fravor's mind immediately went to the possibility of a downed aircraft or a submarine, but as he tilted his jet to get a better look, the situation shifted from confusing to otherworldly. This was not a natural phenomenon, and it was certainly not a submarine or a known wreckage. Rising from the center of that churning white water was a solid object. It was brilliant white, smooth, and shaped exactly like a giant tic-tac candy. It was roughly 40 feet long, with no visible wings, no tail fins, and no windows. There were no engines to be seen, no exhaust plumes, and no rotors to keep it aloft. It just hung there, hovering a few feet above the surface of the ocean. It was an impossible sight for a man who had spent his entire life studying the mechanics of flight. Everything Fravor knew about lift, thrust, and aerodynamics told him that this object should not be able to stay in the air. Yet there it was, defying the very laws of physics and human understanding. It moved with a jittery, erratic motion, like a ping-pong ball bouncing inside a jar, staying right over the center of the disturbed water. Fravor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the cockpit. He was no longer looking at a training target or a known adversary. He was looking at something that defied human technology, a craft that sat in the air as if gravity did not exist. Fravor gripped the controls, his heart hammering against his ribs as the white craft suddenly began to pivot. The Top Gun pilot was about to realize that his superior training and his billion-dollar machine were no match for the impossible nature of the unknown. Commander David Fravor pushed his stick forward, beginning a controlled, circular descent toward the strange white object. He wanted to get eyes on the target, to see the texture of its skin and find some clue as to its origin. As he moved through the turn, his wingman, Alex Dietrich, maintained her orbit high above, watching the scene unfold with disbelief. The white craft did not flee. Instead, it did something that felt deeply personal to the pilot. It began to mimic him. As Fravor spiraled down, the tic-tac began to spiral up, matching his trajectory and speed with terrifying precision. It was an aerial dance, a mirror image suggesting the object was not only aware of him, but was actively engaging with him. Fravor had faced the best pilots in the world, but he had never seen anything move with such fluidity and a complete lack of inertia. The white craft appeared to be a sentient entity in how it reacted. Fravor would later describe it as being pointy in its movements, shifting from one position to another without any visible transition. It was as if it were blinking in and out of existence as it climbed to meet him. Every time Fravor adjusted his bank angle or his airspeed, the tic-tac adjusted its own, maintaining a perfect distance as if tethered to him by an invisible string. The blue water below continued to froth and bubble, a constant reminder that something even larger might still be lurking beneath the surface, watching the encounter from the dark depths of the Pacific. For the first time in his decorated career, Fravor felt a profound sense of vulnerability. He was sitting in the cockpit of the most advanced fighter jet on the planet, a machine built to dominate the sky, yet he felt like he was flying a paper airplane compared to the entity below him. The cockpit, once a sanctuary of high technology and control, now felt cramped and fragile. Every beep of the instruments and every flicker on his digital displays seemed to highlight his own helplessness in the face of such overwhelming power. There was no noise from the object, no heat signature from an engine, and no turbulence in the air around it. It seemed to be manipulating the very fabric of space and time to move through the atmosphere. This kinetic struggle was not one of firepower, but of pure physics. Every instinct in his body was screaming that what he was seeing was impossible. His jet was a slave to gravity, momentum, and drag, while this thing existed outside of those constraints entirely. In every dogfight, there are rules regarding energy management and turn circles. If an opponent turns too hard, they lose speed. If they climb too fast, they stall. But this object ignored all of it, moving with a jittery, instantaneous motion that defied the very concept of mass. Deciding to end the game, Fravor leveled his wings and steered directly toward the object, intending to merge with it. In naval aviation, the merge is the moment two aircraft pass each other at close range. He wanted to see how it would react when challenged head-on. As he closed the distance, however, the tic-tac displayed a burst of performance that shattered his understanding of reality. In a fraction of a second, the object accelerated with such violent force that it blurred and then simply ceased to be there. It did not fly across the horizon or disappear into a cloud. It vanished. One moment it was a solid 40-foot-long object right in front of him, and the next, there was nothing but the empty blue sky and the calm water below. Fravor and Dietrich scanned the area, their hearts racing and their eyes wide, but the sky was suddenly eerily vacant. The radio from the United States ship Princeton crackled back to life. The voice of the air controller sounded shaken, almost hesitant to say what the radar was showing. The controller told Fravor that he would not believe it, but the object had just reappeared at his combat air patrol point. This was a secret, predetermined rendezvous point located 60 miles away. The Tic-Tac had traveled 60 miles in less than a second. For a human aircraft to cover that distance in that time, it would have to travel at thousands of miles per hour, generating forces that would tear any known material to pieces. Yet the object had not only reached the point instantly, it seemed to know exactly where the secret destination was located, a piece of information it should not have possessed. As Fravor and Dietrich headed back to the carrier, another pilot, Lieutenant Commander Chad Underwood, was launched to investigate. Underwood managed to catch the object on his sophisticated infrared camera, often referred to as a FLIR. The footage he captured would eventually become one of the most famous pieces of evidence in history. But even as he tracked it, the craft began to actively jam his radar. It was performing a level of electronic warfare that exceeded anything the United States military was capable of at the time. The most expensive and advanced sensors in the world were being toyed with, showing a level of technological superiority that was deeply humbling to everyone involved. The crew of the Princeton watched their screens in the dark radar room as the object performed maneuvers that were mathematically impossible, leaving the seasoned operators in a state of absolute shock. The emotional toll began to set in as the pilots returned to the carrier. There was a mix of confusion and a growing silent fear among the flight crews. These men and women were the elite of the elite, trained to handle any threat, but they had just encountered something that made their multi-billion-dollar jets look like primitive toys. When Fravor landed on the deck of the Nimitz, he was initially met with jokes and mockery. His shipmates had heard some of the radio chatter and began making cracks about little green men and flying saucers. They laughed and pointed, trying to break the tension with humor, but the laughter died down very quickly when the atmosphere on the ship suddenly shifted. Shortly after the planes were secured, a helicopter that no one had been expecting landed on the deck. From it emerged several men in dark suits, individuals who did not belong to the ship's regular crew, and carried an air of cold, quiet authority. Without much explanation or a formal briefing, these men began to move through the carrier's technical centers. They went to the radar rooms and the data storage areas, seizing the magnetic tapes and the hard drives that contained the digital recordings of the encounter. They took the radar data from the Princeton and the flight recordings from the jets, including the clear evidence of the object's impossible movements. The pilots were told very little, but the message was clear. What they had seen was now a matter of national security, and the data was no longer theirs to keep. Fravor watched as the physical proof of his encounter was carried away, leaving him with nothing but a memory that he would struggle to explain for years to come. The arrival of the outsiders brought a heavy, suffocating silence to the carrier. Fravor and his fellow pilots were left standing on the flight deck, the smell of jet fuel and sea salt hanging in the air, as they watched the helicopter lift off again, carrying away the only tangible evidence of the most significant event of their lives. The mockery from their peers felt hollow now, replaced by a nagging realization that they were part of something much larger and more mysterious than a simple training exercise. The Tic-Tac had not just defied physics, it had punctured the veil of their perceived reality. The silence that followed the departure of the investigators was heavier than the roar of the fighter jets. Commander David Fravor and his wingman, Alex Dietrich, found themselves in a strange, bureaucratic limbo. They had witnessed a defiance of every physical law they were trained to understand, yet the official record was being scrubbed before their eyes. In the weeks that followed, the encounter became a whisper in the hallways of the Nimitz, a story told in hushed tones over coffee in the ready room. They were not explicitly threatened, but the message was woven into the fabric of military discipline. You saw nothing, Or, more accurately, what you saw does not exist in the world of public record. For Fravor, a man built on precision and the cold reality of physics, this forced silence was a burden that weighed on his spirit. The image of the smooth, white tic-tac hovering above the water remained burned into his retinas, a ghost that appeared every time he closed his eyes to sleep. Even as he continued his duties, the world felt thinner, as if a veil had been pulled back and then quickly replaced. As the years turned into a decade, Fravor moved through his career with quiet professionalism, eventually retiring from the Navy. He transitioned into civilian life, but the sky was never the same for him. Every time he saw a distant glint of sunlight on a fuselage or a strange cloud formation, his mind raced back to that afternoon in November 2004. He was haunted by the knowledge that the United States military, with all its technological wonders, was effectively helpless against whatever that thing was. It was a secret he carried into his neighborhood, his home, and his private thoughts. He was a man who knew a terrifying truth about the vulnerability of the human species, yet he had no one to tell who would believe him without the evidence that had been snatched away in those dark briefcases. The weight of the unknown became a constant companion, a silent witness to his everyday life. Then came 2017, a year that would change the trajectory of his life forever. The New York Times published a bombshell report that exposed the existence of a secret Pentagon program dedicated to studying unidentified aerial phenomena. Accompanying the article was the FLIR footage, the very infrared evidence Chad Underwood had captured. Seeing those grainy black and white images on a public screen was like a jolt of electricity to Fravor's soul. The world was finally seeing a glimpse of what he had encountered off the coast of San Diego. The secret was out, but it was being met with a mix of skepticism and sensationalism. Fravor realized that the narrative was being shaped by people who had never been in the cockpit, and he felt a moral obligation to step forward. He was not looking for fame or money. He was a pilot who wanted to provide context to a mystery that the government was still trying to downplay. When David Fravor finally went public, his testimony was a masterclass in calm, disciplined reporting. He did not talk about aliens or little green men. Instead, he spoke of flight characteristics, propulsion systems, and the total lack of wings or engines. He described how the object had reacted to his movements with a predatory intelligence. The tension between his grounded, technical testimony and the government's continued posture of denial reached a breaking point in the halls of Congress and in the court of public opinion. He became the face of a new era of transparency, forcing a conversation about what was operating in the restricted airspace of the most powerful nation on Earth. The existential threat was not necessarily one of hostile intent, but of sheer overwhelming superiority. Fravor's message was a humbling one. He was reminding humanity that despite our mastery of the seas and the skies, we were still like children playing with wooden blocks compared to the architects of the tic-tac. This realization formed the moral center of his journey. It was a lesson in human humility. For decades, the military-industrial complex had built a sense of absolute security, a belief that our borders were impenetrable and our technology was the pinnacle of evolution. Fravor's encounter proved that this was an illusion. Our top-tier defense was, in reality, defenseless. The psychological impact of this was profound. It stripped away the arrogance of the modern age and replaced it with a sense of wonder and a healthy dose of fear. We were no longer the undisputed masters of our own house, and that was a truth many were not yet ready to accept. The resolution of Fravor's story came not with a grand explanation of where the craft originated, but with a simple admission from the Pentagon. In a historic move, the Department of Defense officially acknowledged that the footage was authentic and that the objects remained unidentified. For Fravor, this was the closure he had sought for over a decade. He felt a profound sense of peace. The burden of being a lone witness to an impossible reality was gone. He no longer had to carry the weight of the unknown by himself, because the world was now carrying it with him. He had fulfilled his duty as an officer and a citizen, bringing a hidden truth into the light where it could finally be acknowledged by the institutions that had initially tried to bury it. As we look at the San Diego coastline today, the waves still crash against the shore with the same rhythm they had in 2004. The sun still glints off the wings of fighter jets as they roar out of North Island Naval Air Station. But the ocean beneath the path of the United States ship Nimitz hides secrets that are no longer just the stuff of ghost stories. Advanced sensor systems and radar operators continue to track anomalous objects that move through the water and the air with impossible speed. The tic-tac was not an isolated incident, but a calling card from a reality we are only just beginning to understand. We are standing on the edge of a new frontier, looking out at a horizon where the line between science and the supernatural has begun to blur, waiting for the next encounter that will remind us just how small we really are in a universe that remains vast, silent, and deeply mysterious.